My mother-in-law told my parents to eat in the kitchen 10 minutes before the bank called me by name. That was the part no one in that room understood yet. Not my husband. Owen, standing near the champagne tower, with the fixed smile he used for donors and local press. Not Lorraine Whitmore, draped in emerald silk and family authority, surveying her guests like she had personally invented success. Not the cluster of board members, spouses, and business friends filling the Whitmore's historic house in River Oaks for Owen's promotion dinner. And definitely not the caterer, who froze with a tray of lamb skewers halfway between the formal dining room and the hall when Lorraine lifted one lacquered finger and pointed directly at my parents. "There are too many people at the main table," she said brightly, as if she were solving a seating puzzle and not shattering something holy. "Let your parents eat in the kitchen. They'll be more comfortable there." More comfortable. That lie landed first. Then came the silence. You learn a lot about people from the kind of silence they choose. My father, Walter Rowan. I went still in the way decent men do, when humiliation arrives, dressed as manners. My mother, Marlena, instinctively touched the handle of the peach cobbler dish she had brought from home, as if she could somehow make herself smaller by holding on to something familiar. One of Owen's aunts looked down at her wine. A man from First South Bank took a half step back. Not because he was shocked, but because rich people always know when to move away from the blast zone of another family's cruelty. And my husband? He did nothing. That was the moment the night stopped being about bad manners and became something much worse. Because if Owen had laughed awkwardly and said, "Mom, don't be ridiculous," maybe we all would have had somewhere to go after that. If he had crossed the room, taken the cobbler from my mother's hands, and led my parents to the head table himself, maybe the story would have stayed ugly, but survivable. Instead, he adjusted his cufflink. Just that. A tiny silver gesture under the chandelier while my parents stood there in church clothes and dignity, holding a pie dish and a paper gift bag with a bottle of small batch sorghum syrup from the county where I grew up. That was when I knew my marriage had been over longer than I'd admitted. The house was too warm, too bright. Somebody in the next room was still laughing. Because humiliation in one part of a rich house never travels fast enough to interrupt the people benefiting from the lighting in another part. Through the arched doorway I could see the main table already set. Hand-calligraphed place cards. Imported roses. Crystal stemware. Polished silver. The whole theater of importance. My parents had driven 3 hours in one of my father's only good jackets, so they could clap for Owen when the toast came. Lorraine wanted them to eat next to the industrial sink. I looked at my mother-in-law. Really looked at her. Not at the diamonds. Or the posture. Or the little smile she wore when she thought she was being direct. I looked at the certainty. That was the ugliest part. She genuinely believed she had the right. The right to sort people. To decide who was fit for linen and who belonged near dishwater. To force my parents to swallow the insult because, in her mind, gratitude should outrank dignity when people like mine were invited into houses like hers. Then I looked at Owen. He still didn't move. He was watching me now. Though, not with concern. With warning. The subtle kind. The kind husbands use when they want their wives to understand that the peace of the room matters more than the wound in their chest. Don't make this difficult. Don't embarrass me. Don't turn my mother's cruelty into my problem. I think that was the second thing that broke. Because people always imagine the sharpest pain comes from the one who says the unforgivable thing. It doesn't. Not always. Sometimes the deeper wound comes from the person who could stop it and decides not to. My father gave the smallest, a saddest smile I had ever seen on his face. "It's all right," he said quietly. "Wherever's easiest." That nearly undid me. Not because he was weak, because he was trying to save me. Even there. Even then. Trying to make himself lighter so I wouldn't have to choose between my parents and my husband in front of 80 people and a grazing table that cost more than the truck he'd driven us around in when I was a kid. My mother shifted the cobbler dish higher in her hands. "We don't mind, sweetheart. But I did mind. Not loudly. Not theatrically. The rage that arrived in me wasn't hot. It was cold. Precise. A click inside my chest. Like something locking into place. I smiled. That got Lorraine's attention faster than if I had shouted. It got Owen's too. I crossed the room. Took the cobbler from my mother's hands. Set it gently on the sideboard beside a tower of untouched macarons. And then slipped my left hand into hers and my right into my father's. "We're not eating in the kitchen," I said. My voice was calm enough to make everyone else more nervous. Lorraine's smile thinned. "Celeste? Don't be dramatic." I turned to her and held her gaze long enough for the whole room to feel it. Then I said the sentence that changed the temperature in that house before any phone ever rang. "You're right," I said. "My parents won't be eating here at all." And then I led them toward the front door while every eye in the room followed us. Still unaware that somewhere across town, a senior vice president at First South Bank had already left me 2 voicemails marked urgent. People like Lorraine Whitmore don't begin by insulting you. They begin by sorting you. That was the thing outsiders never understood about my husband's family. If you met them at a charity breakfast or one of the museum dinners they sponsored twice a year, you'd think they were polished. Maybe even warm. Lorraine had perfect posture and expensive restraint. Owen's father, Warren, had built his reputation on the kind of handshake that makes men trust a bad loan because it arrives in a navy suit. Owen himself had inherited the best parts of both performances, his mother's social polish and his father's boardroom stillness. If you only saw them in public, you'd never notice the hierarchy until it was already under your skin. The Whitmores never needed to shout to make you feel lesser. They had subtler tools than that. A pause before introducing you. A sentence that excluded you without sounding rude. A glance at your shoes. A thank you that felt like a correction. They didn't insult people the way crude families do. They arranged them. By the time you realized you were being placed in the wrong category, you were already expected to smile. I had spent 6 years in that system. And in the beginning, I helped build it. That's the part I have to say out loud if I want the story to be honest. When Owen and I met, he was not CEO material yet. He was smart, disciplined, ambitious in a way that looked almost admirable from a distance. He was still running regional logistics for one of the Whitmore family holdings, trying to prove he was more than just another son with good hair and a reputable last name. He liked that I didn't treat him as inevitable. He used to tell people that was what drew him to me. "Celeste doesn't care about power games," he'd say, as if my refusal to perform awe around his family made me charming instead of dangerous. Back then, I thought his respect for my independence meant something. I grew up in a place where nobody owned 3 forks for one meal. My parents, Walter and Marlene Rowan, lived in a red brick ranch outside Corsicana, where my father fixed agricultural equipment and my mother taught 4th grade for 28 years. They were not polished in the Whitmore way. They were decent in a way the Whitmores had forgotten how to measure. My mother still wrapped pound cake in foil instead of buying pastry boxes. My father ironed one church shirt so many times the collar had softened like old paper. They never pretended to be anything else. They didn't know how. I did. That is the embarrassing truth. I learned to move through rooms like Lorraine's before I ever met her. I studied finance, then commercial lending, then risk. I learned what made men in expensive watches take younger women seriously. I learned how to speak in ratios without sounding cold. How to talk yield curves over salmon. How to make old bankers laugh without giving them anything real. By the time I met Owen, I was already working in structured credit for a Houston institution bigger than his family understood. Not publicly. Not socially. And certainly not in a way I volunteered over dinner, because being underestimated is expensive. Yes, but sometimes it is also useful. The Whitmores mistook my privacy for softness almost immediately. Lorraine did it first. The second time I had dinner at their house. She asked where I had bought my dress. I told her it was from a small boutique in Austin. She smiled and said, How lovely. I always admire women who can make simple things look intentional. It took Owen 2 full beats to realize she had insulted me. I pretended not to notice because that was what I did back then. I absorbed. I translated. I downgraded offense into awkwardness so the evening could continue. That became my role in the family before I understood I had accepted one. Smooth things over? Laugh off the cuts. Tell myself Lorraine was from another generation. Tell myself Warren's coolness was just businessman reserve. Tell myself Owen saw the difference. Even if he didn't always speak fast enough to prove it. The first year of our marriage. That illusion still held. Barely. Then Warren's health declined. One of the family companies hit a debt squeeze. And suddenly the Whitmores stopped treating business like inheritance theater and started treating it like oxygen. That was when I became useful to them in a way they never publicly acknowledged. I did not save their entire empire. Stories like this get inflated too easily. But I did build the debt strategy that kept Whitmore Industrial from tripping a covenant breach they had hidden under optimism and old photographs. I did place the first call to First South Bank when no one in that family wanted to admit they were about to lose leverage. I did persuade a credit committee to buy them 18 months of breathing room because I understood numbers better than pride, and because Bryce Kincaid, the regional executive vice president everyone in Texas knew but few people, understood, took my calls before he took theirs. That was the beginning of the misunderstanding that would eventually destroy my marriage. Because after that deal closed, the Whitmores started depending on me while continuing to narrate me as ornamental. In private, Owen would ask what I thought before major decisions. He'd sit across from me at our kitchen island with quarterly projections spread out in front of him and ask, if we refinance through a mixed facility instead of bridge debt, how ugly does it get in year 2? He trusted my judgment in the dark, where credit lines and risk exposure lived. In public, I became his calm wife. Supportive. Tasteful. Grounding. Never once. In 6 years. Did Lorraine introduce me by what I actually knew how to do? She introduced me by relation. This is Owen's wife. In a 13. As if I had floated down from nowhere in silk and good posture. Here purely to soften photographs and pour coffee without embarrassing anyone. And because I didn't correct her. Because I preferred privacy. Because I believed competence did not need applause. The family story settled around me like plaster. By the time of Owen's CEO dinner, they had all accepted the same lie, that I was quiet because I had nothing to say. That my parents were simple because they had nothing to offer. That the Rowans could be moved to the kitchen because people like us were supposed to be grateful just to be invited into a Whitmore dining room at all. They thought they understood where I stood in that house. They had no idea the bank called me first. If Lorraine had simply seated my parents at a side table, I might have still found a way to lie to myself. That's the ugly truth. I might have told myself she was stressed. That the house was full. That people of her generation were careless with optics, but not with intention. I might have helped my mother set the cobbler in the kitchen. Kissed her cheek. Smiled at the guests. And carried that humiliation home like a hot coal in my mouth until it hardened into something private and poisonous. But Lorraine didn't stop at logistics. People like her never do. Cruelty that believes it is justified always has to explain itself. After I told her my parents would not be eating there at all, the room did not erupt the way rooms do in movies. Nobody gasped. Nobody dropped a glass. The caterers did not freeze mid-step in some perfectly arranged tableau of scandal. Instead, everything tightened. That was worse. The musicians in the sunroom kept playing. 2 donors near the staircase lowered their voices without fully turning away. The board member from Baton Rouge shifted his drink from one hand to the other and suddenly became fascinated by a painting over the mantel. Even the crystal seemed to ring more softly. The whole house recognized something shameful had happened. No one wanted to become part of the official memory of it. Lorraine's smile didn't vanish. It sharpened. "Oh. For heaven's sake," she said. Loud enough for the room to hear. Which meant she was no longer speaking to me but to the hierarchy she thought she owned. Don't make a scene just because your parents don't understand how formal dinners work. That sentence landed harder than the first. Not because it was crueler in wording, but because it revealed the full architecture beneath it. She wasn't just pushing them out of the dining room. She was rewriting the insult as a cultural deficiency. My parents weren't being humiliated. According to her version, they were simply unsophisticated, unfamiliar, out of place, by nature. The problem wasn't her cruelty. The problem was our class. I felt my father's fingers shift slightly in my hand. That tiny movement told me everything. He was embarrassed. Not angry. Not defensive. Embarrassed. He was trying to calculate how to save me from becoming the woman whose family ruined the new CEO's dinner. My mother looked at me and did what good mothers do when they've been injured in front of their children. She tried to make herself disappear. "Sweetheart, it's fine," she whispered. "We can just eat later." That almost broke me. Not because she believed it. Because she loved me enough to say it anyway. Owen finally moved then. For one horrible second, I thought he was crossing the room to stop his mother. To put a hand on my father's shoulder. To say the one sentence that could still have changed the shape of the night. But he didn't come toward me. He came toward Lorraine. He lowered his voice and leaned in just enough to look responsible to the people nearest him. "Mom," he murmured. "Just let me handle it. Let me handle it." That phrase sounds different when the woman being handled is your wife and the people being smoothed over are your in-laws. I looked at him and understood. With a clarity so cold it almost felt like mercy. That Owen's instinct was not to protect me. It was to contain me. That realization was the real humiliation. Lorraine had insulted my parents. Yes. But Owen had chosen his side in the same breath and called it diplomacy. Then Lorraine made the mistake that ended everything. She laughed. Not a big laugh. Not something vulgar. Just a brief, airy little sound people make when they think the room fundamentally agrees with them. And then she said, "Ah, Celeste. Really? We have senators, major donors, and the Kincaids sitting at that table. Your parents will be much more comfortable in the kitchen with the staff." With the staff. There are moments when a room changes temperature so fast you can almost hear it. That was one of them. Because even the people who had been willing to excuse the first insult as clumsy social triage could not excuse that one. Not now. Not with 80 people listening. Not with my mother still holding the gift bag with the ribbon she had retied 3 times in the car because she wanted it to look neat. Not with my father standing in a jacket that still smelled faintly of the cedar closet where he kept things reserved for weddings and funerals and events that mattered to me. She had not just excluded them. She had placed them beneath the hired help in her own mind and said it aloud. One of the waiters glanced up, then immediately down again. I remember that because it humiliated him too. Lorraine had managed, in one polished sentence, to demean my parents and the people serving dinner at the same time. And still Owen said nothing. He looked at me then with that same warning in his eyes. "Not now. Don't do this. Not in front of these people." That was the final betrayal. Not infidelity. Not even disloyalty. Exactly. Something smaller and, in a marriage, often deadlier. Cowardice. Dressed as practicality. I released my mother's hand and crossed the room to the sideboard. Everyone thought I was backing down. I could feel it in the way the room exhaled. I picked up the cobbler dish with both hands. Careful not to tilt it. It was still warm. My mother had baked it at dawn. She and my father had stopped halfway to Houston because she was worried the crust might steam itself soft if she covered it too tightly while it was hot. I turned back toward Lorraine with the dish in my arms. "You're right," I said. That got Owen's full attention. Lorraine's too. For one beat. She thought she had won. Then I set the cobbler down in the center of the dining table, directly between the floral arrangement and the silver candelabra. Right on the imported linen runner she had spent half the afternoon adjusting. The peaches bled a little syrup onto the ivory cloth. It was the smallest possible mess. And somehow the most offensive thing anyone had done in that house all night, at least according to Lorraine's face. This, I said, my voice even, is what my parents brought to celebrate your son. Since you've decided they're good enough to feed your guests, but not good enough to sit beside them, I figured I'd save you the trouble of pretending. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. My father said my name softly from behind me. But I didn't turn. Lorraine's face had gone pale in the sharp, furious way expensive women go pale when someone forces the truth into the center of their table and leaves a stain. And Owen, my husband, the new CEO, the man I had once believed would know the difference between grace and surrender, finally found his voice. Celeste, he said, low and furious. You are embarrassing me. There it was. Not my mother went too far. Not your parents don't deserve this. Not even, let's leave. You are embarrassing me. That sentence stripped the room to its bones. And in that instant, with 80 guests pretending not to witness the ugliest thing they had seen all season, I stopped being the daughter-in-law trying to survive the Whitmores. I became the woman who was done explaining why her parents deserved a seat at the table. I didn't argue with him. That was the first thing that unsettled everyone. If I had screamed, Lorraine would have recovered instantly. She was built for emotional messes she could call vulgar. If I had cried, Owen would have stepped into that soft, managerial tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable in front of witnesses. He would have guided me into the study, shut the door, and later emerged with a version of the story where I had overreacted because I was tired, embarrassed, emotional, under pressure. I gave them none of that. I looked at my husband, really looked at him, and felt something inside me go very still. Not numb, not weak. Clear. There is a point in humiliation when pain stops asking for repair and starts asking for a decision. I reached that point the second Owen said, "You are embarrassing me." While my parents stood 3 feet away, holding their own dignity together with silence and good manners. So I didn't answer him. I turned to my mother first. Marlene was staring at the cobbler dish, now sitting in the center of Lorraine's perfect table, as if it had become some terrible reflection of her. My father's jaw was tight, but his eyes were on me. Not on the Whitmores. He knew me well enough to understand that whatever I did next would matter far more than the words already spoken. I stepped back to them and took my mother's hand again. "We're leaving," I said. Not loudly, just clearly. My mother shook her head once. Instinctively. The way women of her generation do when they still think enduring a humiliation is cheaper than making trouble. "Sweetheart, don't do this on our account." That hurt worse than Lorraine's words. Because that's what good parents do when they're wounded in front of their children. They try to make the wound smaller so you won't have to carry it. My mother was ready to let herself be insulted if it meant saving me from a worse night. I squeezed her fingers. "No, Mama," I said softly. "I'm doing this because of you." That sentence changed something in the room. Not because the Whitmores suddenly understood shame. They didn't. Not yet. But because the guests did. The guests understood exactly what was happening now. A daughter was choosing her parents over a marriage in real time. In front of a house full of people who would remember every second of it. Owen took one step toward me. "Celeste. Stop." I turned my head just enough to look at him. There was anger in his face now. Yes. But something else too. Alarm. Because he was finally beginning to understand that I was not heading toward a scene. I was stepping out of his ability to manage the night. He lowered his voice, which always meant he was trying to sound like the reasonable one. "We can talk about this privately." That almost made me laugh. Privately. His mother had just exiled my parents to the kitchen in front of donors, board members, extended family, and the president of the local arts council. And now he wanted privacy. Privacy is the refuge of people who enjoy public power but want private forgiveness. "No," I said. That was all. Just one word. Then I bent. Picked up the paper gift bag my mother had brought. and handed it back to her. I took my father's arm with my free hand and started walking toward the foyer. The room parted for us. That's another thing rich people understand better than they admit. When a moral collapse happens in a formal room, everyone gets out of its way. No one wants the stain. No one wants to be pulled into testimony later, not legal testimony. Social testimony. Nobody wants to become part of the sentence people repeat afterward. I was standing right there when it happened. Lorraine found her voice before we reached the hallway. If you walk out of this house over a seating issue, she called after me, don't expect to be welcomed back until you can behave with some maturity. I stopped. Not because I was tempted to answer, because I wanted the whole room to feel the shape of my silence. Then I turned just enough to meet her eyes across the chandelier light and white floral arrangements and polished crystal and the little puddle of peach syrup still shining on the linen. This was never about seating, I said. I let that sit. Then I added, it was about whether you thought my parents were human enough to deserve your respect. No one spoke after that. Not Lorraine. Not Owen. Not Warren, who had apparently decided this was all beneath intervention. Not the cousins. Not the family friends. Not the people who had spent years treating my marriage like some elegant alliance between old Texas money and fresh usefulness. I kept walking. In the foyer, a houseman moved to open the front door before I reached it. Even that detail stayed with me later, the fact that the only person in the whole house who acted with instinctive dignity was someone Lorraine probably barely registered. The night air hit my face cool and sharp. Behind me, I heard Owen's footsteps at last. Fast now. Celeste. I didn't stop. I led my parents down the stone path toward the driveway. My heels steady on the slate. My mother's hands still in mine. My father quiet at my side. Inside the house, the music had finally stopped, and in my purse, my phone began vibrating again. Persistent. Insistent. The bank. I didn't answer the bank until my parents were inside the car. That mattered to me. Not strategically. Morally. Because the entire reason the night had crossed a line was that my parents had been treated like movable objects in someone else's performance. I was not going to do the same thing to them. Even for a call I had been expecting all day, I opened the rear passenger door for my mother first. Then, for my father. My mother still held the gift bag in her lap like she was apologizing to it. My father sat with both hands on his knees, staring straight ahead, in that fixed, decent silence men learn when they think dignity means not making other people clean up after their humiliation. Only when both of them were seated and the doors were shut did I step away from the car, pull my phone from my purse, and swipe across the screen. 3 missed calls, 2 voicemails. All from Bryce Kincaid. That name would have meant very little to anyone inside that house, except maybe Warren Whitmore. And even he only knew one version of Bryce, Regional Executive Vice President at First South Bank. Old Houston family. Sharp enough to make lenders nervous. Connected enough to make borrowers careful. What the Whitmores didn't know, what Owen had never fully bothered to understand, was that Bryce did not call me because I was helpful to the family business. He called me first because 6 years earlier, when Whitmore Industrial was 48 hours away from triggering a covenant breach they had hidden under optimism and deferred vendor payments, I was the one who walked into a private credit review with 3 binders, a debt map, a renegotiation model, and enough nerve to tell a room full of senior bankers which parts of the Whitmore family's story were real and which were vanity. I was also the one who persuaded Bryce that the company was worth saving. Not because of Owen. Not because of Lorraine's pedigree. Not because Warren could still talk about expansion as if it were a virtue instead of a habit. Because I could see where the structure bent without pretending it was elegant. That was layer 1 of the truth. The Whitmores thought I was adjacent to power. The bank knew better. I hit callback. Bryce answered on the first ring. Ay, Celeste. Where are you? In the driveway. I said. Why? He exhaled once. And I could hear the pressure in it. Not panic. Urgency. Bank urgency is always colder than ordinary urgency. Less dramatic. More expensive. We got a package from Whitmore Holdings' internal office 40 minutes ago, he said. Somebody tried to move revised signatory language through their overnight authorization bundle before Monday review. Your husband's name was on it. I looked back at the house. The front windows still glowed gold. Through one of them I could see moving silhouettes. People resettling themselves into a story that no longer worked but hadn't fully collapsed yet. And? I asked. And? Bryce said carefully. The restructuring only clears if the personal guarantor alignment remains unchanged. There it was. Layer 2. Owen wasn't just celebrating a promotion dinner tonight. He was sitting on the edge of a financing event, large enough to rearrange control inside Whitmore Holdings. The new lending package had to pass Monday morning, and part of its internal comfort structure. What the family liked to call confidence language and what the bank called risk containment depended on signatures they apparently assumed were safe. Mine. Not because I owned Whitmore Holdings. I didn't, but because during the last rescue, when the family's name still carried more confidence than cash flow, I had signed on to a contingency framework. A set of personal indemnity and oversight clauses that nobody in the family liked to discuss publicly because they complicated the myth that Warren and Owen had saved themselves. The truth was uglier and simpler. The bank had never really lent to the Whitmores. It had lent through me. Not directly. Not romantically. Structurally, when the company could not stabilize its leverage alone, I had tied my own private capital vehicles. Trust. Review. Rights. And credit standing into the back end of the deal. Quietly. Cleanly. Without asking for gratitude. Because at the time Owen was my husband and I thought protecting the family business was part of protecting our marriage. Lorraine knew some of this. Warren knew enough to keep his voice polite with me whenever debt was involved. Owen knew the outline and preferred not to look too hard at the details. Because details threatened the version of his ambition that didn't want to feel borrowed. Bryce, unlike all of them, knew every page. Has anything been activated yet? I asked. No, he said. I stalled review, pending direct verbal confirmation from you. That sentence landed deep. Pending direct verbal confirmation from you. In other words, while Lorraine Whitmore was assigning my parents to the kitchen, the bank was holding the next phase of their family empire in the palm of my unreturned call. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was so clean. The entire Whitmore family had spent years arranging people by surface. Dining room or kitchen. Board seat or courtesy chair. Decision maker or spouse. Old family or useful outsider. Meanwhile, the single most important call of the night had bypassed all of them and come directly to the woman they treated like decorative support. I turned slightly so I couldn't see the house anymore. Nothing clears tonight, I said. Nothing moves on my silence. Nothing changes until I review every page personally. Bryce didn't hesitate. Understood. Then, after a pause, you sound calm. I'm not calm, I said. I'm clear. That made him quiet for one beat. Do you need me to prepare for fallout? He asked. I looked through the windshield at my parents waiting in the back seat. My mother still holding the little gift bag. My father still staring ahead. Both of them unaware that the same family that had just tried to seat them beside the industrial sink had its financial future paused by my next sentence. Yes, I said. Prepare for all of it. That was layer 3 of the truth. I was not just the daughter-in-law they underestimated. I was the call the bank waited for before letting the Whitmores touch another dollar. The first sign of panic came before we even left the driveway. Not from Owen. From inside the house, my phone was still in my hand when the front doors opened hard enough to bang against the wall. And Warren Whitmore came out fast, too fast for a man who built his reputation on controlled movement and practiced reserve. He didn't look at me first. He looked at my car, then at my parents in the back seat, then at my phone. That told me everything. Somebody inside had already spoken to somebody important. Probably not Bryce directly. Bryce would never have taken a call from Lorraine in the middle of a family dinner unless fire was actively coming through the roof. But Warren knew enough about how banks work to recognize the difference between inconvenience and structural danger. And whatever message had reached him in the last 30 seconds had pushed him across that line. Celeste, he called, trying for calm and missing it by a mile. Let's all slow down. That phrase almost made me smile. Men like Warren only ask people to slow down when they've realized they are no longer the ones setting the pace. I opened the driver's door and leaned in just enough to tell my father. Give me 1 minute. He nodded once. Still silent. My mother looked worried now, not for herself. But for me? That's what mothers do when a line has been crossed. They stop thinking about the insult and start thinking about the aftermath. I straightened and turned back toward Warren. Behind him, Owen appeared in the doorway, followed by Lorraine. She looked nothing like the woman who had arranged my parents toward the kitchen 15 minutes ago. The righteousness was still there, but now it had company. Confusion, irritation, and beneath both, the first thin edge of fear. Owen took 2 steps down the path. Bryce called you? There it was. No, are you all right? No, let's fix this. No, my mother was out of line. Just the question that mattered most to him. Had the bank called me? I looked at him for a second too long on purpose. Then I said, yes. The air changed. Not dramatically. No one gasped. No one staggered. But Lorraine's face sharpened. Warren's shoulders went rigid. And Owen's jaw locked in exactly the way it did when his public smile was failing, and he knew it. What did he say? Warren asked. I did not answer him. That, more than anything else, made their panic visible. Because powerful families are used to information moving toward them. Money, updates, warnings, signatures, deference. They are not used to standing outside their own house while somebody they have just humiliated decides whether they are worth informing. Lorraine recovered first. Because people like her always retreat into indignation before they acknowledge danger. This is absurd, she said. If this is about dinner, then everyone needs to stop behaving like peasants in a melodrama. I stared at her. Not because I needed to respond. Because I wanted the weight of what she had just said to settle into the silence around us. She had insulted my parents. Lost the room. Triggered a banking crisis. And still chosen the word peasants. Some people really do carry their own indictment in their mouth. Owen shot her a look. Mother. Stop. Stop. Not apologize. Not take it back. Just stop. The same instinct. Always. Contain the optics. Tidy the surface. Control the visible damage while the real structure cracks underneath. My phone rang again. Bryce. This time all 3 of them saw the name on the screen. I let it ring once before answering. Bryce. I kept my voice even. But I didn't lower it enough to hide it from the people standing 6 feet away. That was deliberate. Not cruel. Strategic. There is a difference. Yes, he said. I need to update you. We've paused Monday review completely. Compliance wants written confirmation before anything tied to Whitmore Industrial moves forward. Across from me. Warren closed his eyes for half a second. That was the first truly satisfying moment of the night. Not because he was suffering. Because he finally understood the scale correctly. This was no longer about social offense. It was about institutional exposure. Nothing moves until I say it does. I replied. Bryce was quiet for a beat. Understood. Then, more carefully. One more thing. We've had inquiries from 2 co-lenders asking whether your oversight remains active. Somebody on their side is rattled. I glanced toward Owen. He had gone pale in a very controlled, expensive way. The kind that doesn't read as panic from a distance but looks unmistakable up close. My oversight remains exactly what it was this morning. I said. Then I ended the call. For a second, no one spoke. Lorraine looked from me to Warren, as if she were waiting for him to explain the language in a way that would make it smaller. Warren didn't. He couldn't. Not anymore. Owen stepped closer. Celeste. We need to talk privately. There it was again. Privacy. The refuge of men who discover too late that public disrespect creates public consequences. No. I said. His nostrils flared. You're making this worse. That sentence hung there between us. Bright and ugly and familiar. Worse. As if the problem had begun when I refused humiliation instead of when he let it happen. As if the danger was my response, not their behavior. As if my parents being sent to the kitchen was survivable. But my refusal to absorb it quietly was the real disruption. I looked at him and felt something in me go hard in the cleanest way possible. You still think this started when I walked out? I said. Warren flinched at that. Lorraine folded her arms. Owen held my gaze. Stubborn and scared and still somehow convinced that reason was on his side if he could just get me into the right room and speak in the right tone. It started. I said, when your mother decided my parents belonged in the kitchen, and you chose not to stop her. No one answered. Because there was no answer. Only fallout. Only the house behind them full of guests who now knew something had gone wrong. Only the bank waiting. Only my parents in the car. Where they had more dignity and silence than the Whitmores had managed in all that polished noise. I opened the driver's door. That was when Warren finally spoke plainly. If you don't take this call seriously, he said, voice low and stripped of almost all performance, Monday could collapse. I looked at him over the roof of the car, then at Lorraine, still standing there, wrapped in silk and offense, then at Owen, who had just watched his family insult mine and still believed the central emergency was financing. I did take it seriously. I said. That's why my parents are leaving with me. And then I got in the car. Shut the door. And let their panic rise behind glass where, for the first time all night, it could not touch us. The reveal happened the next morning in a conference room at First South Bank. Under cold glass walls and recessed lighting that made everybody look more honest than they were. That was fitting. Humiliation had begun in a dining room full of chandeliers and curated silver. It made sense that truth would arrive somewhere cleaner, brighter, and less forgiving. Bryce Kincaid had called for an emergency review at 8:30 a.m. The official reason was credit exposure clarification tied to Whitmore Industrial's pending facility renewal. The real reason was much simpler. Too many people at the bank now understood that the Whitmores' financial future depended on a woman they had publicly treated like decorative family furniture. I brought my parents with me. Not into the meeting itself. Bryce had arranged a private hospitality suite upstairs with coffee, breakfast, and an actual table where no one would dare ask them to sit anywhere but wherever they pleased. That mattered to me, more than I can explain. My mother noticed the linen napkins first. My father noticed that the young associate pouring their coffee addressed them as Mr. and Mrs. Rowan without hesitation. Sometimes, dignity is restored in small details before it is restored in public. By Oshem. 22. The Whitmores arrived. Warren came in first. Composed enough to still look like a man who believed proximity to institutions meant ownership of them. Owen followed. Jaw tight. Tie too sharply knotted. Carrying himself, like someone trying very hard not to look like he had spent most of the night watching his future recalculate itself. Lorraine came last. Wrapped in cream, silk, and cold fury. As if fabric alone could preserve hierarchy. The moment she saw me already seated at the far end of the conference table, something flickered across her face. Not fear. Not yet. Disorientation. Because this was not her house. Not her dining room. Not one of her donor circles or family rooms where she understood the hidden ladder and where to place everyone on it. This was a bank. And in a bank, the person who gets called first is the person the room actually answers to. Bryce entered exactly on time. No apologies. No pleasantries. Just files. A tablet. And the dry professionalism of a man who had spent 20 years watching wealthy families confuse credit with immortality. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "We need to clarify authorization, guarantor continuity, and risk oversight before Monday review can proceed." Lorraine opened her mouth immediately. Surely this could have been handled with a phone call? Last night was already. Bryce held up one hand. She stopped. That was the first public crack. Not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. Lorraine Whitmore, who had rearranged my parents like surplus cutlery 12 hours earlier, had just been silenced with a gesture in a room where her social authority meant absolutely nothing. Bryce looked down at the documents in front of him. For the record, Whitmore Industrial's current banking structure remains contingent on external capital confidence, guarantor alignment, and discretionary review provisions attached during the 2018 restructuring. Owen stepped in smoothly. And all of that remains intact. Bryce turned his head and looked at him with the kind of polite stillness bankers reserve for people who have started speaking too early. "Does it?" he asked. No one answered. Then he touched one line on the tablet and the screen at the end of the room lit up. There it was. My name. Not in small print. Not buried in schedules or appendices. Centered in the review summary under active authorization dependencies. Celesta Rowan. Contingent oversight. Lorraine stared at the screen. Then at me. I watched her trying to put the pieces together. And I almost pitied her for the half-second it took. Because the humiliation she had delivered the night before had been effortless. Casual. Thoughtless in the way only inherited power can be. But now she was being forced to do something much harder than apologize. She was being forced to understand. Bryce continued. Voice even. When Whitmore Industrial came under stress 6 years ago, this bank did not extend support on reputation alone. We extended it under a contingency structure negotiated and secured by Ms. Rowan. Miss Rowan. Not Mrs. Whitmore. Not Owen's wife. Not family by marriage. My own name. Spoken in the cleanest room possible. Owen shifted in his chair. That was a temporary accommodation. Bryce's expression did not change. Temporary accommodations do not become irrelevant simply because the beneficiaries grow comfortable. That one landed. Warren looked at me then. Really looked at me. And I realized with a strange kind of calm that for all his intelligence, he had spent years deciding not to know too much about how his son's future had been financed. Men like Warren prefer gratitude that arrives invisibly. It lets them keep their pride and their solvency at the same time. Bryce changed the screen. Now it showed the pending authorization sequence for Monday. One signature line was redacted pending review. Mine. We paused the package because the individual whose approval stabilizes the structure had not confirmed consent. He said. Last night. Before this family finished dinner. Ms. Rowan instructed us that nothing would move without her direct review. The room went completely silent. This was the reveal. Not a scream. Not a scandal. Not me tossing some cutting line over Crystal and expecting justice to clap. This was better. This was an institution looking at the Whitmores and saying, with paperwork and timing and screens no one could argue with, the woman you tried to send to the margins last night is the reason your financing exists at all. Lorraine's voice came out smaller than I had ever heard it. Why was I never told? I looked at her. Because that was the real question. Wasn't it? Not why the bank had called me first. Why the family had decided it was more convenient never to say my name out loud. Because, I said quietly, you preferred the version of me that didn't require respect. No one in that room moved after that. And for the first time since I had married into their family, every person at that table finally understood the same thing at once. They had not insulted the wrong guest. They had insulted the woman holding the door open between them and collapse. The collapse did not happen all at once. That's what people who've never watched a family lose control always get wrong. They imagine shouting, Slammed fists. Public sobbing. Some huge, spectacular scene that clearly divides the powerful from the fallen. Real collapse is quieter. It starts when a room stops believing you. After Bryce finished speaking, no one at that conference table moved for a long second. Warren looked down at the documents in front of him like he was searching for a technicality big enough to crawl inside. Owen's posture changed first, not dramatically. Just enough for me to see that his confidence had shifted from persuasion to damage control. Lorraine sat absolutely still, her hands folded too tightly in her lap, wearing the rigid expression of a woman discovering that a social mistake had become a structural one. And that, more than anything, was her real horror. If this had stayed a family offense, she could have survived it. Families are built to metabolize private cruelty. People excuse it, rename it, bury it under phrases like stress, miscommunication. That's just how she is. But the moment the bank attached itself to the insult, it stopped being domestic. It became measurable. Bryce slid one more page across the table toward Warren. Because contingent approval has not been affirmed, he said. The Monday facility review is suspended. Co-lenders have been notified. Treasury coordination is on hold until oversight status is clarified. Warren looked up sharply. Suspended? Yes. For how long? Bryce's answer was precise enough to wound. For as long as necessary. That sentence cracked the room open. Not visibly. Not the way an outsider would notice. But I saw it in Owen immediately. He sat back in his chair. Then leaned forward again. Then stopped himself. His hands wanted to move. That was how I knew he was scared. Owen only became physical when words stopped obeying him. This is excessive, he said. Carefully. Trying to sound like the adult in the room. Surely we can separate last night's social misunderstanding from a financing decision that affects hundreds of employees. Social misunderstanding. There are men who can reduce anything if it protects their position. Humiliation becomes misunderstanding. Betrayal becomes timing. Cowardice becomes pragmatism. And if they get enough years to practice it, they start to believe compression is the same thing as innocence. Bryce didn't blink. The financing decision is affected because the person you all appear to have treated as socially optional is contractually indispensable. That one landed. I didn't need to say anything. The bank had said it for me. Lorraine finally turned to me. Really turned. No silk. No charm. No hostess voice left. Just the raw, unvarnished anger of a woman who had suddenly discovered the floor had standards she wasn't high enough to stand above. You let this happen, she said. That almost made me laugh. Not because it was absurd. Because it was so perfectly her. Even now. Even here. Even after seeing my name at the center of a deal holding up her family's future. She still needed me to be the one who had disrupted order. Not the one who had been insulted. Not the one whose parents had been degraded. The one who had let consequences arrive. I met her gaze and kept my voice level. No. I let last night happen. This is just what it cost. Owen's head snapped toward me. Celeste. That tone again? Warning. Wrapped in intimacy. He still believed some private version of me could be called back into usefulness if he said my name correctly enough. Bryce closed the folder in front of him. I'm going to say this once so there is no confusion. Until Ms. Rowan confirms oversight continuity. No review proceeds. No signatures move. No internal assumptions matter. No internal assumptions matter. That might have been the cruelest line anyone said all morning. Because the Whitmores had built their whole house on internal assumptions. That they would always be received a certain way. That people like my parents would always take the lesser seat. That I would keep doing the invisible. Stabilizing work while staying grateful for proximity. That banks ultimately called men first. Not this bank. Not anymore. Warren cleared his throat. Celeste, he said. And for the first time in the entire 6 years I had known him. My father-in-law sounded less like a patriarch and more like a borrower. What exactly would it take to stabilize this? There it was. The language of power had changed. Not forgive us. Not, let's move past this. Not even what do you want? What would it take to stabilize this? Because once people stop believing they are morally right, they retreat into transaction. I thought of my mother holding that cobbler dish. My father standing in his best jacket while Owen adjusted his cufflink instead of stopping his mother. The guests pretending not to witness any of it. And then I thought of my parents upstairs. Drinking coffee at a proper table in a room where no one would dare sort them by usefulness. I looked at Warren. Then at Owen. Then finally at Lorraine. Today, I said. It's already unstable. That was when Lorraine broke. Not theatrically. Not with tears. Her kind of breakdown came out as fury because fury still let her pretend she was above shame. This is extortion, she said. You are holding this family hostage over a dinner seating disagreement. Bryce actually looked offended then, which surprised me. No, he said coldly. Your family is under review because you failed to understand the structure you were relying on. Lorraine's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing came out. That was the beginning of her collapse. Not loss of money. Not loss of face. Loss of language. Owen stood so abruptly his chair legs scraped the floor. We are not doing this in front of outsiders. I turned to him slowly. Outsiders? I repeated. He realized too late what he had said. Bryce heard it. Warren heard it. Even Lorraine heard it. Because her eyes darted toward me with fresh alarm. That was the problem with men like Owen. Under pressure. They stopped hiding the hierarchy they lived by. Outsiders. Meaning the bank. Meaning me. Meaning anyone not born inside his family's mythology of entitlement. I stood too then. But calmly. Last night, I said. My parents were outsiders in your mother's house. Today your whole family is outsiders in a room that finally knows who matters. No one followed me when I walked out. They couldn't. Because for the first time in their lives, the Whitmores had found themselves trapped in a place where money wasn't enough. Manners weren't enough. And family name wasn't enough. They had to sit there and feel what my parents had felt. Unwanted. And unable to change the table. The first thing I got back was not power. It was the right table. When I left the conference room, Bryce was waiting outside with one of the younger associates from hospitality. He stood the moment he saw me. Not in the stiff corporate way, men rise for status. But in the older, more human way, people rise when they understand something important has just been restored and they do not want to be careless around it. Your parents are upstairs, he said. I thought you might want lunch sent in before they leave. I did. Not because they were hungry. I don't think any of us had felt hunger since the night before. But because I needed one clean image to replace the one Lorraine had branded into me, my parents being redirected toward the kitchen like they were incidental. So I nodded. A proper lunch, I said. At a real table. Bryce's mouth shifted, not quite a smile. More a recognition. Already handled? The suite upstairs overlooked downtown through long panes of clear glass. By the time I walked in, a round table near the window had been set with white plates, polished flatware, linen napkins, and simple arrangements of pale flowers. Nothing gaudy. No performance. Just care. My mother stood when she saw me. My father followed half a second later. They were still wearing the same clothes from the night before. But the humiliation had changed shape on them. It no longer looked fresh. It looked tired. My mother reached for my face before she said anything. Are you all right? That nearly undid me. Not because I was fragile. Because mothers are miraculous in the most exhausting way. They can be insulted publicly. Moved aside. Made to feel small in a house that was never theirs. And the first thing they ask their child afterward is whether she's all right. I put my hand over hers. I am now. My father glanced at the set table. then back at me. Suspicion and pride fighting quietly across his face. Honey, he said. What exactly is going on? There are truths you reveal dramatically. In public, when the room has earned the humiliation of finally hearing them. And there are truths you reveal gently, because the people listening never asked for any of the mess built around them. So I told my parents the clean version. Not every clause. Not every covenant. Not every structure Bryce and I had discussed the night before. Just the part that mattered. That the bank was not waiting on Warren Whitmore. It was waiting on me. That years earlier, when the Whitmores had needed saving, I had done more than smooth over a rough quarter. I had tied my own standing, my own review rights, and my own judgment to the deal that kept them breathing. That Owen's promotion, the dinner, the confidence, the family performance, it all rested on structures. No one in that house ever liked saying out loud, because those structures made me impossible to classify as just a wife. My mother sat down slowly. My father did not. He stared at me for a long moment, then looked out the window, then back again. And they knew. Enough, I said. He nodded once. That was all. My father had never been a man who needed speeches to understand betrayal. Men like him measure character by what people do with knowledge, not by whether they can explain it prettily later. Lunch came then. Soup first, then roasted chicken, vegetables, warm bread, and coffee poured into actual cups instead of paper. An associate pulled out my mother's chair. Another offered my father more tea and waited for the answer like it mattered. I wish I could say that what moved me most was the elegance of it. But that would be false. What moved me was the normalcy. No one here acted as if respect were a gift. They acted as if it were baseline. That was the beginning of me taking my name back, not in a boardroom, not through a signature, but in a room where my parents were treated as if dignity required no explanation. The second thing I got back was my voice. That happened 2 days later at Whitmore Industrial's interim review. When outside counsel asked whether I intended to remain in the guarantor structure if the bank extended a modified facility under new governance conditions, the old version of me would have looked at Owen first. Even after everything, reflex is powerful. Years of marriage teach you where to place your eyes before a decision. Whose reaction to monitor, whose comfort to factor in, but the old version of me had been built around managing atmospheres. That woman no longer existed. So when the lawyers asked the room the question, I answered without glancing at my husband once. Yes, I said, under conditions that reflect actual authority, not family mythology. That sentence did more than any legal memo could have done. Because for the first time, I did not soften the truth to make it livable for the Whitmores. I said the thing out loud in the room they cared about most. The problem was never confusion. It was mythology. Their mythology. Their belief that blood, manners, donor lists, and old names entitled them to arrange everyone else beneath them. Not anymore. Lorraine spoke only once in that meeting. Not sharply. Not grandly. Her voice had become thin in a way I had never heard from her before. I never meant, she started. I stopped her with a look. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted accuracy. You meant exactly what you said, I replied. The only difference now is that the room understands what it cost. No one defended her. Not Warren. Not Owen. Not even the cousins who had once floated around her like decorative satellites at every family function. That was the third thing I got back. Not just respect. Witnesses. People had seen it, understood it, and, more importantly, stopped asking me to carry the burden of interpretation alone. By the end of that week, Bryce had rerouted all communications tied to the facility through my office first. Not Warren's. Not Owen's. Mine. The email signature line looked almost absurdly simple the first time I saw it. Celeste Rowan. Oversight. Signatory. No Whitmore attached to it. No relational title. No family gloss. Just my own name and the authority they had tried so hard to keep socially invisible. That was when I understood what I had actually taken back. Not their company. Not their house. Not the marriage. Something better. The right to be named correctly in a room that matters. 3 months later, I sat at my parents' kitchen table and watched my mother cut peaches for a cobbler she no longer brought anywhere she wasn't fully welcome. That was the new order. Not the bank documents. Not the revised governance package. Not the fact that Whitmore Industrial had survived only after Warren agreed to a humiliatingly strict oversight structure with my name at the center of it. Not even the divorce papers Owen eventually signed in a law office where no one cared about his promotion dinner. His family name. Or how carefully he tried to phrase regret. Those things mattered. They changed the architecture around us. They forced the Whitmores to live inside consequences they had never imagined applied to them. But the real ending was smaller. It was this. My mother set out 4 plates without apologizing for the table being crowded. My father reached for the iced tea and asked whether I wanted lemon without sounding like a man, afraid he was taking up too much room. No one here lowered their voice when they said my name. No one here measured who was fit to sit where. And nobody, not once, suggested the kitchen was a lesser place. That's the strange thing about power. When you've spent too long around people who weaponize it, you start thinking, justice must look grand to be real. You start expecting chandeliers, boardrooms, 2 signatures, and public reversals. You start believing a wound only closes if the same people who cut you are forced to watch it heal. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it should. But peace is quieter than revenge. And once the noise dies down, peace turns out to be the thing you were starving for all along. The Whitmores learned that too. Though not in the way they would have chosen. Warren lost his assumption of control first. He kept the company. Technically, but not the freedom to move inside it as if no one had the right to question him. The bank review was extended. The co-lenders insisted on outside monitoring. And every major decision now passed through structures he could neither charm nor overrule. He still wore his suits. Still shook hands. Still hosted people in rooms lined with old oil portraits and expensive silence. But everyone who mattered knew his confidence now came with conditions. Lorraine lost something worse. She lost certainty. Not reputation. Women like her always keep some version of that. Society is generous to elegant cruelty if it arrives with enough floral arrangements and legacy donations. But the thing she no longer possessed was the invisible social gravity she had relied on all her life. People still accepted her invitations. They just watched her more carefully. She still spoke in polished tones. They just did not rearrange themselves around her the way they once had. And, to her eternal irritation, she was never again able to pretend she did not know exactly who I was. Owen lost the easiest future. That was the most fitting outcome of all. He did not collapse spectacularly. No public ruin. No cinematic destruction. Men like Owen rarely explode, they erode. The divorce finalized in 9 weeks. Cleanly. Efficiently. He kept what was his. Lost what wasn't. And spent the next quarter learning what it felt like to be important only inside systems with actual memory. Without me attached to the financing review. His rise slowed. Without the family myth that everything naturally bent toward him. His confidence started looking what it had always secretly been dependent. The last conversation we had happened in the parking lot outside the mediator's office. He stood beside his car with his jacket folded over one arm and said, "I never thought you'd do all this. All this, as if defending my parents, protecting my own leverage, and refusing to swallow humiliation constituted some radical overreaction rather than the most basic form of self-respect." I looked at him for a long second and realized I no longer had the energy to be angry. "That was always your problem," I said. "You thought too much of yourself and too little of what I would protect." He didn't answer. He looked like he wanted to. Like maybe there was still some version of the story where he had merely made mistakes instead of revealing character. But there are truths men only understand once the people they relied on stop carrying the emotional cost of explaining them. I got in my car and left him there. Now, on Sundays, I drive out to Corsicana more often than I used to. My mother has stopped asking whether it's too much trouble. My father no longer tries to wave me off from helping with the dishes after dinner. Small things. Deep things. The kind that matter because they show you exactly where shame used to live and where it doesn't anymore. Sometimes, when the light goes soft in the kitchen and the windows fog a little from the oven, I think about that night at the Whitmore's house. The chandelier, the linen, the cobbler dish on the center of Lorraine's immaculate table. Owen's voice telling me I was embarrassing him. The front door opening behind us as my parents and I walked out. If I'm honest, the bank calling me first was never the true victory. It was only the proof. The victory was what happened before I answered. I chose my parents. I chose to leave. I chose not to negotiate with a room that had already told me what it thought I was worth. That is the truest order I have now. Not money. Not leverage. Not revenge. Clarity. The kind that lets you hear an insult for exactly what it is. Stand up without shouting. And walk toward the life that still knows your name. And once you have that, no one ever sends the people you love to the kitchen again.